So, dear Professor Smith, thank you very much for having accepted to participate on the project História em Quarentena. The project is coordinated by 6 volunteer historians from 4 different countries: Paulo César Gomes, Melanie Tuyoá, Carlos Trinidad, Mariana Muñoz, Lucas Pedretti, and me, Natália Guerellus. Despite the support received from some academic institutions, all of our expenses are funded by public crowdfunding. For this special program, I'd like to thank my friend Julia Froza, who helped me with the elaboration of this interview. This is our last week of 20, since the project began on the 23rd of March 2020. During this time, we had with us many guests, among them many researchers, activists, teachers, artists, journalists. We talked about the pandemic crisis, about gender and feminisms, authoritarianism, indigenous people in Brazil, Black movement and racial questions, Brazilian dictatorship, Brazil and Latin America, about Paulo Freire's work, among other important issues for Brazilian society from a global point of view. Gender and racial diversity were always some of our main concerns to invite our guests, as well as a diversity of age, nationality, and professional status. Today, we have with us one of the most important contemporary world historians, Professor Bonnie Smith, distinguished history professor at Rutgers University. She held many fellowships throughout her career, from Guggenheim Foundation, Princeton University, from the American Council of Learned Societies, and the National Humanities Center. Professor Smith has published many books by herself and with other historians. The book, The Gender of History, Men, Women, and Historical Practice, was translated into Portuguese in 2003. I think the title in Portuguese is Gênero e História, Homens, Mulheres e a Prática Histórica, by Editora Mulheres, from which we expect to have another of her books translated as soon as possible. This interview has 3 main goals. First, to explore the trajectory of Professor Bonnie Smith, presenting it to the Brazilian public. To discuss issues related to historiography and gender studies into more detail, and to talk about Professor Smith's latest thoughts and works, such as The Making of the West, Peoples and Cultures, a book organized with Lynn Hunt, Thomas Martin, and Barbara Rosenwein. And Professor Smith told me that it is in, I think, the 7th edition will be soon available. And Women in World History, 1450 to the Present, a book published in 2011, but also the last version, I think, in 2018 or 19. And maybe we could talk about other books, such as Acts of Appropriation, How Global Obsessions Created Western Modernity, a new book that will be published soon, I hope. So we're going to see with the interview. So I'll begin with the question, Professor Smith, could you please begin talking a little bit more about your trajectory as a historian in the United States and how you became interested in women and gender studies?
So thank you so much for inviting me. I'm just thrilled to be speaking to people in Brazil. It's just a great honor to be able to talk about my work and just to interact with Natália and with your team. It just sounds like such a wonderful project. So I'm really deeply honored to be part of it. I began as a historian pretty late for someone in the United States. I had been part of the women's movement as a young woman, as a young mother, wife and mother. I had not gone to graduate school, but I did know one thing about history. My aunt had said to me, do you know that Susan B. Anthony, who is an American feminist, is our relative and is your cousin? Well, that was fine. I did not know who Susan B. Anthony was. And I didn't know until even in my 20s who she was, because there was no women's history when I was in the university. Then, in the women's movement, a professor who lived near me said, well, the women's movement would be fine if you could tell me 5 women who had ever done anything important. Well, the shame of it was, but it's part of people's background in those days, that's the late 1960s and early 70s. Could you name 5 women who have ever done anything important? I could not. So part of the women's movement, I was active in the state that I lived in at that particular time. But then I moved to a new place, and there was a university with a great history department in those days. And I decided, well, maybe I'd go to school. So I was 31 and went to school and studied with some pretty eminent people. And I had decided at that point I would study women's history. I would try to study women's history. It was not a big field. There was no one interested in that field where I was. In addition, the first couple of days of graduate school, I discovered that a couple of the women in my class, there were only 3 of us out of 20-some, had been told that they should go home, that they did not belong in graduate school. So I was a little older than they were, and this really was infuriating. So from that point on, I studied with someone who worked on Third Republic France, and he was very interested in the bourgeoisie, the middle classes. And so I got interested, and I decided to study bourgeois women, because some of the professors there were Marxists, and they were talking a lot about the bourgeoisie. And the question was, are women bourgeois? I mean, what is their relationship to the means of production? I was going through all of those things. So a week or so before I moved to France, my family was in the process of moving to France where we lived for quite a while. And I decided I'd go to Lille, where I knew there was a flourishing textile industry, and it was a revelation. On the one hand, my first book was about the women of the Lille bourgeoisie, and what I discovered was that women had been so active in the founding of the textile industry. Not only had they managed them, they had actually managed putting out the outwork that was done in the 18th century, and then they were very active in the initial stages of factory work. But they were driven out, and so I described their lives as bourgeois women. And what I found was that everything that they had done once they were more or less removed from factory work and into domestic life ran counter to what a bourgeois was. A bourgeois was rational, not religious. Most of the men in Lille were not in those days in the 19th century religious. After World War II, they became more religious than they were in the 19th century. So I studied those women and their relationships to their children, to their relationships to the church, their social work, some of the novels that they wrote, including Charles de Gaulle's grandmother was a novelist who lived in the north of France. And that was my first, so that was my introduction. And my book came out, it was finished in 1979, 1980. The great Joan Scott was the reader for it, so I felt so privileged to have her be the reader for it, and she was extremely helpful, and wonderful. So those are the initial stages of becoming interested in women's history. It came out of being in the women's movement. Along the way, actually, I learned who Susan B. Anthony was, and I learned that there were, by 1980, I knew that there were thousands of important women in history. Now, in those days, I was mostly interested in French history and nothing else. So that went on for a while. I don't want to know. I'm wondering whether you want me to continue on this my trajectory, or do you want to move on to another question? Or
yes. I think we can move to the other question, because we start to talk about world history and how you pass through so I think you begin with the women history, French history, and how do you go to the global history or Western history?
Okay. Yes.
And the second question is, how do you see the making of history in the Western world? Because you have a book with Lynn Hunt, Thomas Martin, and Barbara organized with them that talk about this. And if you see your production in some way as a deconstruction of how we have made scientific history since the 1800s.
So I'm going to make a slight detour, because my second book was about a concierge in Paris. And that book was an experimental book. It was written first as I will just say it was written in many different voices. So it was very experimental. And I thought, okay, I'm moving on from this working class woman. I had done bourgeois women, and then working class women. And in 1989, I wrote a book called Changing Lives, Women in European History. Now that book was a big survey of women since 1700 in all of Europe. So my horizons were expanding, and it was a textbook. So I'd written two different kinds of books, and now I was writing a textbook. As I was writing that book, I was approached by Lynn Hunt's team to see if I would participate in writing what was then called the Challenge of the West. It's now called the Making of the West. And Lynn Hunt and the team, I was brought on as the last, maybe next to last person on the team, had this brilliant idea that European history actually was connected to the world. Now, it's hard to tell you how revolutionary this idea was. And I will tell you that, for example, in those days, a book that was a survey of French history usually did not mention that France had colonies. It was the story of the hexagon. That is it. The hexagon and all the people who lived in it. And when I was a graduate student, what we learned were, all the departments of France. We learned the capital of every department, and everything that was going on in that space. The mountains. We were like French kindergarten. My kids went to French school, so I know what they learned. They learned about the mountains, the rivers, every little detail of that hexagon. So here was Lynn Hunt saying, we as a team have decided we're going to write a history of Europe that has the rest of the world in it. And obviously there were some people who were thinking about this, but this was truly the first, I would say, mainstream textbook that brought in the colonies, influences from other cultures, just that sort of thing, that there were migrants in Europe, people who were brown and black were in Europe, and even that ideologies were influenced by the world as a whole. So that was that book, and it's almost become mainstream in one way, but people talk about being Eurocentric now. But to my mind, most people now who study Europe are not Eurocentric. The real problem is Amerocentrism. It has been very hard to get Americans and American history to take into account the outside world, or even to write now, this is 20 years ago, 30 years ago, to write about race. Race did not really play an integral part of American history and is just getting in fairly recently. Of course, I'm very old, so when I say recently, I might mean 20 or 10 or 20 years ago, because of my age. So this Amerocentrism is often projected onto Europe. I think Europe is far less. All you have to do is read a European newspaper, and you know that they have so much more information about the rest of the world than any American newspaper does. So we were moving into that stream of things. In addition, I came to know some of the people, some of the great people who were innovating in world history in those days. So there are two influences there. One was being part of this team, the Challenge of the West, now called the Making of the West. The idea that Europe is not an entity that was fully formed, but rather it's made from the world. It's made from the world. It's made from varieties of people, not just people who speak Parisian French or something that, or High German or some that sort of thing. So that was one influence. A second influence was getting very much not involved with, but being greatly influenced by people in the United States who were doing world history with their new idea of world history, that world history is not area studies. It's not, in the United States, world history meant, okay, we'll do East Asia. Okay, Latin America. And we'll move maybe from one civilization to another. So by the early 1990s, the Journal of World History was founded with the idea that world history is about connections, and that it's about men who cross oceans or who ride horses across the steppe and try to get into Europe, or other people who might be global writers or authors. Well, to make a long story short, I was so infuriated by something that one of the greatest of these world historians said. He said, history is about movement. If you're not in a caravan going along the Silk Road, if you're not in an army, an American army, let's say, in World War II going to the Pacific, you don't belong in world history. And he looked at this big audience and he said, sorry, women don't belong in this new world history. Well, if that wasn't infuriating, I don't know what was infuriating. That's when it really took it off in my mind that there were things to do. Mm-hmm. And I just want to say along the way, and maybe we'll get to this question later, women historians, because they were not part of kind of the mainstream in the United States, could do a lot of crazy things. And so to say, because women are often looked at as crazy anyway. And one of the historians about whom I have a book, Lucy Maynard Salmon, in 1900, she was using laundry tickets. She was using cookbooks, etc., as documents instead of what you find in archives. So the idea is you can be more of a risk taker in a way, which is my second book is about I took a big risk. But it's in a great tradition of women because they're not so well regarded in the profession, or weren't. Now I think many women are highly regarded, but they can be greater risk takers. And that's how I started writing a book, doing a collection on global feminism, and editing 3 volumes on women in global history for the American Historical Association. And that kind of movement from French to Europe and the world, to women in the world. Now, I just want to say one more thing about this. This is not universally approved by women historians in the United States. I have a wonderful friend who's from Hong Kong, who now, I won't say where she teaches, and she said, world history is just American imperialism. So that's something to deal with, I think. Although other women who do African history will say, oh, we've gotten over that. So it's a bit of a, it's something there. Is world history just something, an American idea of conquest?
Yeah. I think it's maybe about, I think in Brazil also, when we think about global history, we have this idea, it's a common sense maybe, but this idea that is a perspective from the big economies, such as America or Europe. So they want to do Europe global history because it's their point of view, this imperialism. I'd like to ask you also about something maybe more theoretical, I don't know, but why is it important to incorporate gender discussions when you talk about the construction of historical narrative? I remember also in the Gender of History, you have a chapter where you talk not about the women that wrote the right history, but about the historians, men, but when they were young, and their letters, work with their letters from and for their mothers. So I love this chapter because we see in another way these classical historians from the 19th, 20s. So I'd like to know, why do you think it's important to incorporate gender discussions, and not just women history, but gender discussions in the construction of historical narrative?
Well, that is such a great question, and it really brings so many thoughts to mind. The first, I guess, that springs there, as I think of these little boys who are being beaten in boarding schools, and now one thinks of their bodies being beaten, and then one thinks of, as I think I have in that chapter, and I have to say I wrote it so long ago I almost can't remember it, but there are different fantasies about what they're doing, how they're suffering, and how they see fairy princesses, and how they're freaked out by women coming into their classroom. There's so many stories about these historians as men. And I will say there's one very distinguished English historian, now deceased. When I was writing that book, I asked him about Eileen Power. Well, he gave me some of the juiciest tales. They were lascivious. He would talking about how she made eyes at all the men. In other words, along the way, these men have lives that have nothing of the, quote, objective to them. They have a rich fantasy life. And then, if one goes through their work, you see, in fact, embedded in their work are these hidden fantasies of the world. and that I tried to incorporate into the book itself. And so in describing objectivity, a lot of these men have trouble actually coming up with, quote, objective definitions or situations, because they are deeply sexed and gendered individuals. And we know this is true, and it's still remarkably true. I went to one state maybe 15 years ago. So 15 years ago, I'm a pretty old woman by that time. And this man, I was giving a big lecture, and this man came up to me afterward at a party, and he said, "Hello, little lady. That was a mighty fine talk. I hope you're going to get tenure sometime, but maybe not, because we don't really give women," so that kind of diminution of women, and seeing the hierarchies and having emotional and flirtatious responses with women. So there's a lot of gender in the profession. Now, and there was at the founding of what's called scientific history, and that's the beginning of what I wanted to show. The next part of the gendering of history, and of course all of this comes from the great work on gender that anthropologists did in the 1970s, and how their work, and then that fed a lot of historians who started theorizing gender. But it becomes very clear that gender is one of the great hierarchical power categories in the world. So why would you leave that out? Now, I want to backtrack a little bit and say the most obvious reason for having women in history is that we just want to present the richest, most accurate portrayal of the past that we can. And just to have men killing one another as the most important thing in history, well, that doesn't get us very far in really understanding what life was like, or what human values were, or what scientific achievements were about. If we don't have women, it's just a pretty silly exercise. And of course, I learned that in one of the first graduate courses I took, where the main thing men wanted to know is how to do battles. How you what do you call them? You just draw them on the blackboard. So that seems pretty silly, but so the richness of the human past, and of course we're starting to, it's been happening, obviously. African American historians from the 19th century in the United States have been writing, collecting documents, and setting up libraries, reading rooms, etc. And so that's another part that's being brought in, and these days really people are rethinking so much about what the category of race is, and the thinking of gender goes on too, and now it's been connected through the theories of intersectionality. But gender itself, besides being something that allows us to make a richer tapestry, really is a category of power that is just not considered yet as a major thing in textbooks that students read. People drop in women the way you drop in, I don't know, noodles into a soup or something like that. They just drop it in. But in fact, just to write a gendered history is a great undertaking, because one has to really write about the world from the point of view of how gender operates all along the way in every deed and in everything that's, every event that we've seen from one perspective, isn't there a more important perspective? I don't know. Is class more important than gender? I wouldn't think so. I would say my own opinion is gender is a primary category in human life. And of course, that's being made so complicated today, which is great. It just pulls us into a new realm of thinking. So gender is just important as a category, as power. How does power operate? Yes, maybe it operates through class, maybe it operates through status. But I think primarily, I'll just say it flat out, gender is the major category that is yet to be fully explored, fully utilized, fully appreciated.
Mm-hmm. I agree. Yeah, and so the gender of history was a book written in 1998, I think,
Yes.
published in 1998, and in Brazil
Yes.
in 2003. But could you talk about your latest books, and thoughts? Because I'd really like to know a little bit more about acts of appropriation, how global obsessions created Western modernity. As I said earlier, I think I love this title, but I'd like to know. So after the 2000 and 1998, how it was for a Brazilian public that knows the gender of history. How did you work? How is your... So if you could talk about your latest works, please.
So the gender of history came out in 1998. That's 22 years ago. So that's a very long time ago. I don't know. Obviously, people have liked it or read it. I don't know if it's changed the world in one way, but one thing I hope it gives people tools to think about these issues that we seem to get stuck in. And the thing is, and actually Joan Scott wrote about this issue, but in a different context, is the complexity of the past, where in fact these male historians, especially as we get to people like, I won't go into any names, but people who say, yes, truth is truth, people are equal, and at the same time believe that men are better. So people hold competing ideas in their minds. So that is one of the, that history is so complex. And of course, it's something we're dealing with today with people who are racist and for egalitarianism, or people who are, racist and seem to have done fine things. Or, we can point to many heroes of movements who were plagiarists and criminals, but at the same time, they then redeemed themselves and did wonderful things. So it's the complexity of history that's interested me. So if I jump up to my book on my manuscript on acts of appropriation, this book started as in response to the idea that America and Europe created themselves out of their own genius. And they never borrowed from anybody, they never took from anybody. They just are so smart that without reading anything or looking at a picture walking up some holy mountain in Tibet, they have come to great illumination. And this came out of this book, even though it's still not published. I started it in 2001. I was so angry at the response to the attacks on the World Trade Center, which I actually watched from my New York apartment window. But the response to that was, we need to get rid of people who don't belong in the United States, who are, brown or black, or who are of some other ethnicity, who speak a different language, because they don't belong here and because they have never contributed an iota to American culture, U.S. culture. So I started looking at how actually Europe and the United States were really pathetic in terms of what they knew and what they could do and what their values were, and started studying the people who had studied them. And I'll just take an example of, there's so many examples. Europeans did not know how to make cotton. They did not know how to make color-fast dyes. They did not know how to print any textiles. They could weave different colored threads, but they could not make cotton. And gradually, over a century and a half, they, borrowing, stealing, figuring out how that was made. Porcelain is another example. It took 300 or 400 years to figure out how the Chinese made porcelain. But also other values, such as tolerance. Frederick the Great writes an opera about Montezuma, and he says people in other cultures never killed people because of religion. And the book is about how ideas, knowledge of how to make things, values, know-how came from other countries. I'll just give another example. The drilling of oil in the United States, which started in the 19th century, uses the Chinese seed drill to drill that oil. It is not American know-how. It is Chinese know-how. Or the idea of self-reliance is taken by Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of the one of the Massachusetts intellectuals, from Indian. He read deeply in Indian thought, and you can go through many of his writings and see word for word that he has copied the Bhagavad Gita and some of the Vedas and made them into Americanized them in a certain way, so that the things that kids read in school, or at least when I was a kid, we used to read in school, are taken from other thought. We can go through Nietzsche, we can go through Schopenhauer, I'm trying to think of a French thinker at the turn of the 19th into the 20th century. Well, I'll skip him. Ideas of gender, of the plasticity of gender fluidity, comes right out of a mixture of ideas about reincarnation that are brought into theosophy, so that every seventh incarnation you change your sex. Ideas of sexual restraint and different forms of birth control are also taken by Alice Bunker, who spends a lot of time with one Indian group late in the 19th century, and she creates them into a sexology book, and she's arrested for it. So we can go right down to through the 1968, the reading of Mao's, getting ideas from Mao, or getting ideas, or wanting to be Che Guevara, where people across the whole Bolshevik idea, a lot of Bolshevik ideology and music, Skriab, and have come out of non-Western thinking about the clashes of the world. We know that Monet and most artists, between Hilma af Klint, the great theosophist painter who just had an exhibit at the Guggenheim Museum, makes the first abstract painting because she has read into non-Western philosophy. Kandinsky follows in her footsteps. we can go right down to the present, and there's virtually nothing in US or European culture that somehow is not borrowed from another non-Western culture. Natural childbirth, well, of course, Robert Oppenheimer, one of the major inventors in the atomic bomb, along with lots of the Nazis, they're all deeply into non-Western thought. Oppenheimer spends most of his time reading Sanskrit. And what he says when the bomb is dropped is right out of Indian philosophy, which Google then borrows to make as its motto. So that's what my book is about. It's about jazz, everything. There's virtually nothing that doesn't come from somewhere else. And I can also say the whole engineering from skyscrapers, I followed that path from Indian steel or iron and glass construction that's borrowed in the early 19th century that gradually leads to the making of the Crystal Palace down, and then it's picked up by other architects who eventually make skyscrapers using those Indian engineering principles. So it's really the built world, it's the idea world, it's obviously the food world, all comes from somewhere else. But the question I had didn't deal in the first iteration of that manuscript was the idea of appropriation. Mm-hmm. Because for me, everyone is an appropriator, but it's the gradations of appropriation, and I just have to work out that last little piece of the puzzle.
And I'd like to make you a question that is not in our script, but
okay.
I was thinking because one of the most interesting things that I saw in your work, it's how you work with documents. I mean, your documents, it's just so they are diverse, they are different. So I'd like to ask you which documents you use, for example, to think about this appropriation and make all these relations, and how do you think document that it's really important in science history? So
it's such a great question because people, well, I think 15 or 20 years ago, Dan Wolfe wrote about how women in the 17th century related to how they saw history everywhere. They saw it in monuments, they saw it in their family furniture, they saw it in many, many different things. And actually, that's one thing I might have mentioned is one sees, if one doesn't look at just the scientific historians, but at ordinary people and the amateurs, that they make everything into a document. Now, so I guess the idea is everything's a document in one way. And I remember a colleague of mine, Deborah Gray White, who's a very distinguished and creative African-American historian. And she said when she wrote her dissertation about African-American women early in the 1980s, the men on her committee, they were all men, said, "You have not used the official documents." And she said, "I have used official documents. There are no African-American women in it." They still had trouble. Now, Deborah is great. What she did was she went back, she just listed documents that had nothing in them, and she passed. But it is there is this idea too of so one has to be inventive doing any kind of history. There's also a sense of reading the unwritten record people who aren't literate, people, Eric Wolf, the people without history, and one of my colleagues with whom I write the world history textbook, Mark Vandermeer, he not only does he say he's one of the world's great cuneiform specialists, but he will say about all these things that he can actually read, well, we really don't know what they mean. And I think that's another problem, is not just what documents do you use, how you hierarchize them, but actually, do you really know what they are? And he points out and works with, in our world history book, he has a whole chapter on unwritten record. People in the Pacific Islands who don't have a written record. Now, of course, he's working in the 3rd century, 2nd century, that sort of thing, or people who where we can't read what they've left behind. So that's a problem as well. I don't give a lot of thought about documents anymore because I just use everything. I try to use everything: images, artifacts, different official documents, diaries. One of the great finds when I did my dissertation was finding a woman's account book, how much she paid to get her kids better and things like that. So the world is just full of things, and people are also, another of my former colleagues, Marissa Fuentes, wrote about slave women where there's no record of their lives, only of their torture and their death. And that's another issue. Actually, there's a French woman who's written a book on death at sea. Again, something death, writing, so there's a lot of, that's the wonderful thing about history, is that it's become so polyvalent, polymorphous. People's creativity just is astonishing and wonderful. So that's good.
Well, I'm going to make my last question.
Yes.
That is really important to me as a historian here and as a teacher in the undergraduate studies for undergraduate students. So, and in a digital world. So the question is, I'd like to know how you see the relation between historical research and, on the one hand, teaching, and on the other hand, the large public.
Yes, I have some ideas about that. Historical research and teaching. Of course, my students never did research for me, but I always taught big classes, the big survey classes, and also seminars. And I didn't feel that my research was connected to my teaching, except it gave me tons of material that I could make lectures vivid, or the students would also give me ideas. And that's why teaching is so great, because especially if you're teaching an 18-year-old, they have ideas about what you're writing about, what you're talking about. And I usually would use writing, what I was writing about, to interact with them. And they had tons of ideas and always asked questions that sparked research interest. So that was fantastic. On the second question, the larger and maybe that doesn't quite answer your question. And you can tell me if it doesn't. But the second part is, I actually just finished working in something that was so much fun. Making a long YouTube, being part of a YouTube team that it's called Crash Course. You might look it up. It has tens of millions of viewers. And I wrote the scripts for Crash Course European History. And the scripts are very short, and actually a crash course is only 10 or 15 minutes. But it is for kids, but also for the general population, and it will do 15 minutes on, let's say, the Black Death, 15 minutes on World War I, 15 minutes on the Great Depression, that sort of thing. So what happens is I write a very dull script, like a historian script. I try to put a few interesting people in the script. And then what happens with Crash Course, and I highly advise you to look at it, they have a Crash Course, World History Crash Course, European. I'm hoping to do a Crash Course, hoping and praying to do with PBS a Crash Course, Women in World History. Then what happens is they have animators who put in little figures who are like, the popes, and doing all sorts of interesting movements. And so it's, as my sister said, it looks like characters out of a video game or something like that. And it's very fast-paced, and the narrator is someone who's a great young adult author. He's known as he's the inventor of Crash Course. And so when you look at it, so here they take my very boring script and they make it into something so interesting. You can't, my children who are far older than you are like to look at it. And people in the and students in high school use it to review for exams, or in college even. Sometimes college teachers are using this to open the class up, to get the class moving. So that's my interaction with the general public. But I also try to do it in textbooks. I try to make them as interesting as possible, fill them with people, ordinary people, big people, so that one actually sees human consequences, human leadership, human creativity in books that are for an 18-year-old or for the general public.
So, do you want to say something else? I'm going to finish. I don't know if you want to say something before.
To see if I left anything out I desperately want to say, but I think
okay.
you've just been a wonderful interlocutor, and I appreciate our conversation very much. Thank you.
Thank you for your precious time, and I learned a lot. My English is a really poor English. I'd like to talk better, but I learned a lot. Thank you very much, Vanessa Smith, and I hope to see you again.
Yes, in Lyon.
In Lyon, maybe. Yes.
Or in Brazil. Great. Or New York.
Great. Yes, that will be good too.
Yeah. Thank you.